Since Russia launched its brutal invasion of Ukraine on February 24, 2022, there have been calls for NATO to admit Ukraine into its ranks, but there are several problems preventing that from happening. First, the question of whether NATO's consideration of admitting Ukraine into NATO's ranks was the catalyst for the invasion. Next, NATO must decide whether Ukraine would be able to defend itself in case of another attack on its borders, as well as come to the aid of other NATO members if one of them were attacked. There's also the problem that every current NATO member must approve Ukraine's bid for membership, which seems more likely than the currently stalled request for membership from Sweden. Did NATO cause the invasion, as Putin claims? There are a lot of observers of Russia's invasion of Ukraine who believe that the war would have never happened if Ukraine had been allowed to join NATO before the war. Although Putin had repeatedly blamed NATO for causing the conflict, no one in the West believes his lies. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said publicly that if his country had been given NATO membership prior to February 2022, the invasion would never have happened. The united front that NATO presents would have been too much for even Russia to contend with. It's clear that Putin was looking to attack Ukraine before they had a chance to join NATO. Once Ukraine's membership had been placed on track, there would have been no way to conquer them without involving the rest of NATO. In fact, one of Russia's top military leaders up till the recent events surrounding his interrupted march on Moscow, Yevgeny Prigozhin, has stated publicly that the invasion wasn't because of Ukraine being a threat to Russia, but was instead the result of Russian oligarchs' greed. According to Prigozhin's recorded statement on June 23, 2023, the Defense Ministry, meaning his two chief rivals, Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu and head of the General Staff of the Armed Forces, Valery Gerasimov, tries to deceive the public and the president, Putin, and tell a story that there was a crazy aggression from the Ukrainian side and that the Ukrainians were going with the NATO alliance to attack us. Therefore, the so-called special operation on February 24th was started for completely different reasons. Why was the war needed? The war was needed so that a handful of scumbags could have a blast and get PR attention showing how strong the army is. Prigozhin went on to accuse Russian oligarchs of wanting to profit from looting all of Ukraine, not just the previously occupied regions of Donbass and the Crimean Peninsula. So no, there's no evidence that Ukraine's possible long into the future admission into NATO was anything more than an excuse by Putin for what he thought would be a quick land grab, the same kind he was able to pull off in 2014. Does Ukraine need NATO's protection? Most experts agree that if Ukraine had joined NATO at some point after it gained its independence from the Soviets, Putin's dreams of reforming the USSR would have stayed a dream. Anyone who's followed the invasion with anything close to an honest appraisal will be aware of the horrific damage that's been done to the country. Whole cities like Mariupol and Bakhmut have been leveled. Schools and hospitals have been targeted, not accidentally, but on purpose. Then there are the two massive environmental catastrophes, one that's already occurred and an even more horrific one that's been prepared and is still pending. The first disaster occurred on June 6, 2023, when Russian occupation forces blew up the Nova Kakhovka Dam on the Dnipro River. For a few days, there were various claims and counterclaims about who was responsible, but as the weeks went on, it became clear that the dam, built during the height of the Cold War by the Soviet Union and designed to withstand even a nearby nuclear blast, was too massive to have been destroyed by Ukrainian missiles. Evidence eventually came out that the only way the dam could have been destroyed was with hundreds of pounds of explosives detonated deep inside the bowels of the structure. This, experts agreed, could have only been done by the Russian forces, who were the ones with access to that portion of the dam. The subsequent floods released from the Nova Kakhovka reservoir devastated the homes of more than 10,000 Ukrainians. Russian troops on the left or eastern bank of the river fled without helping any of the citizens on their side and took every boat they could find with them. And when Ukrainian soldiers attempted to evacuate citizens on their side, Russian forces fired artillery and mortar shells at them. What might be worse is that the impounded reservoir held back by the dam fed a canal that supplied as much as 85% of the fresh water to the Crimean Peninsula. Estimates are that it could take several years and possibly as long as a decade to restore water to the area. Even if water flow to the Crimea is restored sooner, the region between the dam and Crimea used that same reservoir water to help irrigate their fields, long considered a major food-producing area for much of the world. Without that irrigation, crops will suffer and farmers will lose their lands. Along with the drownings of the civilians and the loss of water to Crimea, there was also a spill of up to 800 tons of crude oil into the Dnipro, which then polluted the region of Kherson downstream and eventually flowed into the Black Sea. Additional pollution came from the numerous oil and chemical supplies downstream of the dam in and around Kherson. There were also reports of Russian landmines washed away by the floodwaters, which began turning up on shore downstream. So it's no wonder that this disaster has been called the worst ecological catastrophe that's befallen Europe since the Chernobyl meltdown, which also happened to be on Ukrainian soil, and was also the fault of Soviet and Russian actions. Why would Putin do something that he even called in a phone call to Turkey's President Erdogan barbaric? Analysts believe in part that Putin expected Ukraine to retake Crimea as well as much of the territory of the 4 Russian-occupied oblasts in the southeast of the country. Like a child saying, "If I can't have it, you can't either," he thought his best course of action was to make this area of Ukraine unusable, even if it meant drowning thousands of innocent civilians and starving untold millions more. That's why the possibility of an even worse environmental catastrophe still awaits Ukraine and seems far too likely. There are reports that Russian troops have mined the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, the biggest nuclear power plant in all of Europe. If that plant is blown up, it could lead to a massive cascade of nuclear pile meltdowns, since the Novokakhovka reservoir was also supplying the cooling water to the 6 nuclear piles at the heart of the sprawling power plant. If that happens, the radioactive fallout could spread across 90% of Ukraine, as well as parts of Poland, Belarus, and even Russia, if the wind blows from the southwest. This isn't just wild speculation, though. An announcement on June 22, 2023 by U.S. Senators Lindsey Graham and Richard Blumenthal confirmed this. They introduced a bipartisan resolution declaring that Russia's use of nuclear weapons in Ukraine or the destruction of the occupied Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant would be considered an attack on NATO, requiring the invocation of NATO Article 5, which says that any attack on one member of NATO will be considered an attack on all the members. Having been criticized for not denouncing Putin's demolition of the Novokakhovka Dam, this time they made their statement loud and clear. Senator Graham stated, "Our message is to those around Putin. If you do this, if you follow his order, if he ever gives it, you can expect a massive response from NATO, and you will be at war with NATO." It is possible that the U.S. Senate has been briefed with classified intelligence describing how the Russians have already prepared the nuclear plant for demolition. This knowledge has been widely shared by Ukraine's intelligence services. The main Directorate of Intelligence for the Ministry of Defense, Major General Kyrilo Budanov, in an interview with the British publication The New Statesman on June 23, 2023, said the prospect of a Russia-initiated accident at the power plant has been raised before, but this time he believes it's different. The situation has never been as severe as now, he warned. The same Ukrainian intelligence service had previously warned the world as far back as December 2022 that Russia had mined the Novokakhovka Dam and were prepared to destroy it at any time. In addition to these pre-planned and heartless ecological disasters, Russia is continuously attacking Ukrainian civilian centers with ballistic missiles and drones, cruise missiles fired from ships in the Black Sea, and launched from long-range bombers flying deep within Russia, as well as artillery shells fired from occupied Ukraine, from the Belgorod section of Russia, and from the country of Belarus to the north. These attacks are not targeting military positions, but civilian centers, hospitals, schools, and power stations. Too often, Russia has used cluster munitions on such targets, which are banned from being used in civilian-populated areas. Refugees from Syria are sadly quite familiar with the Russian tactic of intentionally targeting hospitals and schools. Russia did this throughout their years of military support of the Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad, and they're continuing their streak of terrifying civilians in Ukraine. Sources have estimated that Russia has fired more than 5,000 combined missiles and drones at Ukrainian cities and civilian infrastructure. They're firing them so fast that some of the missiles show evidence that they've been manufactured just weeks or even days before they were launched. It's imperative that Ukraine gains the ability to defend itself from such lawless attacks. The only way that that can be achieved is with the protection afforded by the rest of NATO. There's a problem, however, with Ukraine's acceptance into NATO. That problem is the same one that protects each member in case of an attack on any one of them, Article 5. The implication is that if any member is admitted into NATO while in the middle of a war, then immediately every other member is involved in that war also. Such a hair-trigger event is what keeps NATO from admitting countries currently involved in ongoing conflicts. Does EU membership go hand in hand with NATO membership? While it's not required for NATO membership, being a member of the European Union does provide certain benefits. For one, it proves the country has or is making progress toward following a democratic rule of law, as well as cracking down on corruption and allowing free speech and fair elections. While these are not the primary indicators for NATO admission, which is focused more toward defense spending and overall military capability, they are positive signs that show a country can be trusted with goals similar to NATO's. Accession to the EU requires accepting and implementing implementing what's known as the Copenhagen criteria, which includes 3 primary areas of focus. The first includes respect for democracy, the rule of law, and human rights. The prospective member must also prove that they have a functioning market-based economy. The third item is that the country must agree with and incorporate the EU acquis communautaire, the body of common legal rights and obligations. Over 80,000 pages, this is a binding agreement for all EU member states. Although, if you search through the EU's official journal of legislation, you'll find that the EU has passed a staggering 666,879 pages of law since its inception in 1957. Out of those, only around 26% of those regulations passed since 1957 are still active. So the true size of the active acquis communautaire is over 170,000 pages long, of which over 100,000 pages have been produced in just the last 10 years. Officially agreeing to all of these laws is one reason why a country might take years to be fully eligible to join the Union. According to Timofey Milovanov, the president of the Kyiv School of Economics, an advisor to the Zelensky administration and a past Ukraine Minister of Economy, when the EU offered Ukraine its candidacy status in June 2022, the EU asked Ukraine to perform 7 primary tasks. By June of 2023, a year later, the EU reported on what it has and has not done. Out of the 7 priority areas, 2 have been deemed satisfactorily complete, 1 is making good progress, and 4 are listed as having made some progress. Complete means all measures the EU requires for compliance have been put in place. For Ukraine, these 2 pillars cover having a fair judiciary and a free and open media, reform of 2 key judicial governance bodies, and the adoption of legislative protections for Ukraine's media have been fully implemented. Good progress means the key measures have been taken, but some measures still remain to be adopted. The EU has judged that Ukraine has made good progress on its constitutional court reform by adopting necessary legislation in its first reading, but the law is pending a second reading. This is just a formality and should be approved sometime this summer. Some progress means that some measures have been taken, but critical measures remain to be approved. The EU has judged that some progress has been made in the 4 categories of anti-corruption, anti-money laundering, de-oligarchization, and the protection of national minorities. Anti-corruption efforts have been addressed through the appointment of new heads of Ukraine's Specialized Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office, or SAPO, and the National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine, NABU, with Ukraine now needing to establish a credible track record of prosecutions and convictions. They'll also need to restore the e-asset declaration system, which requires Ukrainian public officials to disclose earnings and assets, in an effort to combat corruption and enhance accountability of public figures. How long will it take for Ukraine to join the EU? It was at the June 2022 European Union conference held in Brussels, the EU's Council granted Ukraine candidate status. That means if Ukraine follows certain guidelines and obligations for membership as outlined above, they can be admitted as a full member. Though the deadline for such inclusion has not yet been set. Ukraine was hoping they'd be admitted to the EU within 2 years of the submission of their request, made only days after Russia's invasion in February 2022. Ukraine's Prime Minister Denis Shmyhal has said publicly he would like to see Ukraine's admission ratified within that 2-year span. Following his comment, a liberal Belgian EU lawmaker said almost jokingly that it might not happen even in the following 5 years. In the past, EU membership acceptance has generally taken much longer. The last country that was admitted into the EU was Croatia in 2013, after a decade of waiting for their acceptance. Ukraine's neighbor Poland had to wait almost 20 years before they were admitted in 2004, although it's clear that in Ukraine's case, there are extenuating circumstances that might suggest a speed-up process. The ravages that the war has caused to its cities and economy mean that Ukraine will require more assistance from the EU than any European country since the end of World War II. Moreover, with so many billions of dollars in aid potentially being sent to the country, the EU would need to provide both oversight of the funds as well as lending their expertise in managing such huge amounts of aid. As with NATO, the biggest impediment to Ukraine being admitted into the EU is the possibility that Russia's invasion might still be ongoing. The EU's rules don't specifically prevent a country at war from being admitted, unlike NATO's strict prohibition. Generally, the EU in the past has avoided admitting countries that have ongoing military conflicts, even low-level ones. However, it did admit Cyprus in 2004, despite the island's disputed status since being invaded by Turkey in 1974. Turkey itself has had its membership application fall into stagnation after President Tayyip Erdogan began several crackdowns on critics following what he called an attempted coup in 2016. The EU's requirements for political openness and democracy have fallen on deaf ears under Erdogan, which has caused the EU to table Turkey's request for the time being. There are several countries whose admission requests have also stalled. Albania, North Macedonia, Moldova, Montenegro, and Serbia are the most talked about, but there's also Bosnia and Herzegovina, Kosovo, and Georgia. And as with NATO, each member must agree to allow any new members in, so even one holdout can block a potential admission. In Ukraine's case, however, it would represent a much more impactful new member. It would become the EU's largest territory and would represent the fifth largest population with roughly 44 million citizens, following only Germany, France, Italy, and Spain. Another interesting comparison with NATO membership is the discussion of how the EU would change if and when Ukraine is admitted. The membership of a large, well-populated country on the eastern end of the bloc would raise significant geopolitical implications, paving the way for a new north-south Warsaw-Kyiv axis that could rival the traditional Paris-Berlin one. In fact, Poland has been one of Ukraine's strongest supporters against the Russian invasion, and it would be one of its most significant trading partners when EU membership is finally approved. Professor Keating also commented on the difficulties of gaining a consensus for a group of countries that's already relatively large and unwieldy. The bigger the European Union gets, the more difficult it becomes to make decisions and engage in collective action, he said. And the EU is already having problems with recent admission Hungary, a current NATO member with a bad track record of maintaining democracy, which has been a thorny issue when it's come to Sweden's request to join NATO, which Hungarian President Viktor Orbán opposes due to their criticism of his autocratic rule. What about Ukraine's military? So far, we've looked at all the reasons why Ukraine needs NATO support and why they most likely can't be admitted until the current invasion by Russia is peacefully concluded. There are those who believe even discussing Ukraine's eventually joining NATO is a bad thing. In an interview from June 3, 2023 on NPR, John Denny, research professor at the U.S. Army War College and a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, was asked his opinion. Denny said, "I think after the war is over, membership of Ukraine in NATO is going to be the only way to deter a future Russian attack and all the instability and insecurity that would then have. But until the war is over, frankly, I think discussing membership for Ukraine in NATO or other security guarantees is really a bad thing for Ukraine, actually. Because if there's discussion of this, if there are security guarantees offered, frankly, I think it incentivizes the Russians to fight harder and fight longer. The Russians will not be very eager to end the war if they know Ukraine is going to jump into NATO as soon as it's over." This brings up a terrible catch-22. Ukraine needs NATO's protection because of the Russian invasion, yet they can't gain the protection until the war ends. By that time, either Ukraine will have won and the protection will have come up too late to help, or Ukraine will have lost, at which point they won't need that protection any longer. What's needed at this point is an honest inspection of the different branches of Ukraine's military. Can Ukraine defend themselves against what was considered up until just a year ago the second best military in the world? Thankfully, NATO members have done an outstanding job of supplying Ukraine with almost everything they need to defend themselves. When the invasion first began, they received over 17,000 portable anti-tank weapons, mostly in the form of US-made Javelins and Swedish-made Carl Gustaf recoilless rifles, and Stinger surface-to-air missiles in just the first few weeks. Since then, they've received more than $200 billion worth of military aid from NATO members, including additional manned portable air defense systems, manpads like the US-made Stinger, along with Turkish attack drones, the highly accurate US-made missile artillery systems dubbed HIMARS, and other artillery systems, as well as tens of thousands of rounds of small arms ammunition and artillery shells. And after almost a year's delay, Ukraine is now beginning to receive tanks and infantry combat vehicles from Germany, France, the UK, with the US-made Abrams tanks due to arrive later this year. The UK has also supplied Ukraine with its long-range Storm Shadow missile, which can hit targets more than 150 miles from the front lines. The good news doesn't end there. Ukraine has managed to capture a huge number of tanks and IFVs from the retreating Russians. By October 2022, Ukraine estimated that they had more tanks at that point than they had at the beginning of the war. And through Ukraine capturing their abandoned vehicles, Russia had actually become their largest provider of armored fighting vehicles. The US has earmarked a total of $113 billion of total aid to Ukraine. Of the $113 billion approved in 2022, about 3/5, or $67 billion, is made up of military supplies already produced by the US, mostly sitting in stateside stockpiles, which the US will simply replace with newer products. The remaining 2/5, $46 billion, is delegated for non-defense projects, such as general Ukrainian government support, economic support, and aid for refugee resettlement. By June 2023, Ukraine has approximately 17,000 of its ground troops trained in the UK under a program called Operation Interflex. By 2024, that number of Ukrainian troops trained by the UK alone is expected to reach close to 37,000 soldiers, with additional thousands trained in Germany and Poland as well as the US. Ukraine is now operating an undisclosed number of US Patriot air defense systems which have recorded multiple shootdowns of Russia's supposedly unstoppable Kinzhal hypersonic missile. The Patriot has proved to be a godsend for the defense of cities like Kyiv, which have seen seemingly endless bombardments by Russia since the first days of the war. Germany has delivered 32 out of a planned 37 Gepard self-propelled anti-air systems, which are especially effective against drones that would be too cheap for the Patriot's $4 million a shot missile to intercept. Germany is also training Ukrainians on their state-of-the-art Iris-T SLM system. Boasting a range of about 25 miles and a 360-degree view, the system in use protecting Kyiv is said to have intercepted 50 out of 50 targets so far as of March 2023. Ukraine has also accomplished something no other country in modern times has done. They've sunk a modern capital ship from an adversary's navy without a navy of its own. Using imaginative native-designed drones and stealth boats coupled with a newly designed anti-ship missile, Ukraine has put a real hurt on the Russian Navy, sinking the flagship of the Black Sea Fleet, the Moskva, as well as the Saratov, one of their very few Alligator-class tank landing ships. In all, Ukraine's managed to sink 18 Russian ships while forcing the Black Sea Fleet to move much further east into the Sea of Azov to put themselves out of range of Ukrainian attacks. Ukraine is only lacking one key ingredient for their country's defense: modern fighter jets. While other former Soviet bloc countries like Poland have sent Ukraine most of their old Su-27s and MiG-29s, what Ukraine needs are more advanced jets, like the US's latest version of the F-16. But sending those jets has so far been seen as too provocative an act by the West, especially the Biden administration. However, there are programs underway to train Ukrainian pilots to fly the F-16, as well as the ground crews necessary for the plane's upkeep and operation. Currently, Denmark and the Netherlands have agreed to begin training Ukrainians on their F-16s, while Australia is considering sending a small fleet of 41 surplus Fa-18 Hornets to Ukraine, planes which Australia is replacing with the F-35 stealth fighter. There are also discussions underway to provide Ukraine with Sweden's highly regarded JAS-39 Gripen fighter, which has the advantage of being cheaper than F-16s, easier to maintain with only a 6-man ground crew, and is designed to be able to use highways as their runways. This allows their air force to be dispersed more widely than an air force whose planes must be kept at an easily targeted airbase. All of this military assistance and training, together with the grit and determination of Ukraine's highly motivated population, has made the Ukrainian armed forces into perhaps the most powerful military in Eastern Europe. They've also turned Russia into what Secretary of State Antony Blinken called the second strongest military in Ukraine. With their recently launched counteroffensive underway, Ukraine will have its chance to prove just that. And hopefully, when they've managed to force the Russian invaders out of their country, they'll become the reliable eastern bulwark of Europe. A well-equipped, well-trained, and highly motivated Ukraine will become one of NATO's strongest members when they're finally allowed to join. Now do your part and watch deadly weapons the US is sending to Ukraine, or click this other video instead.